The hum of the engines had been steady for the first hour of the flight, the kind of sound passengers quickly grew used to. It was a late afternoon trip, a routine flight bound for Dallas, the sort that businessmen, families, and tourists often filled. Overhead bins rattled softly as the plane hit a pocket of turbulence, a mild bump that drew a few nervous chuckles and shifted coffee in paper cups. But then, without warning, the aircraft jolted again, this time harder. A sudden drop sent passengers pressing against there. Gasps rippled through the cabin. A flight attendant hurried down the aisle, her smile slightly forced, telling passengers to keep their belts fastened. "Just a little rough air," she said cheerfully, but her voice trembled on the last word. The lights flickered once and steadied. Somewhere near the back, a child cried. The captain's voice came over the intercom. It was deep, professional, but carried an edge no one could quite ignore. "Ladies, we've encountered some stronger turbulence than expected. Please remain seated with your fastened. Our crew is trained for this and we'll get through it together." Passengers exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. Pilots were supposed to sound unshakable, yet his tone carried strain, the kind that suggested more than just rough air. The turbulence grew. A rolling shudder passed through the fuselage, followed by another sharp drop. Trays rattled, bags shifted, and more than a few passengers closed their eyes, whispering prayers under their breath. Then something unusual happened. Instead of remaining behind the locked cockpit door, the captain himself appeared in the cabin. He moved quickly but deliberately, his uniform immaculate, his jaw tight. Crew members froze for a moment, surprised to see him there, but they didn't dare question it. Passengers turned their heads, curious and unsettled. The captain scanned the rows, his eyes moving from one face to another as though searching for someone. He didn't speak to anyone, just kept walking down the aisle with purpose, his hand gripping to steady himself against the tremors of the plane. People stared at him, bewildered. What was he doing out here instead of in the cockpit? In row 14, near the emergency exit, sat a girl with dark hair pulled back into a simple braid. She wore a hoodie 2 sizes too big, sleeves covering her hands. At her side was her mother, a tired-looking woman in her 40s clutching a paperback novel she wasn't reading anymore. The girl had been quiet for most of the flight, earbuds in, sketching absent-mindedly on a pad balanced across her knees. The captain's gaze stopped when he reached her row. His expression shifted from searching to something sharper, almost like recognition. He crouched slightly so he was level with her, ignoring the curious stares of surrounding passengers. Leaning close, his voice dropped to a near whisper. "You've flown before, haven't you?" The girl froze, her pencil pausing midline. Her mother frowned, instinctively placing a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Excuse me," she asked, her tone tight. The captain's eyes, however, never left the girl's face. He studied her like a man confirming a memory. The faint rumble of turbulence carried through the floor, making the moment all the more surreal. Finally, he added words that made the air seem to vanish around them. "Top Gun." Gasps came from nearby passengers who overheard. A businessman in the aisle seat leaned forward, confused. Someone whispered, "Did he just say Top Gun?" The girl blinked rapidly, her lips parting as though to speak, but no words came out. Her mother stiffened, shaking her head. "She's just 14, she said firmly, her voice low but sharp with disbelief. The captain didn't argue. He just looked at the girl with a desperation he couldn't hide. The weight of his stare said enough. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't confusion. He had asked because he already knew something. The hum of the engines grew louder, and the aircraft gave another uneasy lurch. Passengers shifted nervously, whispering, wondering what they had just witnessed. Why on earth would a captain ask a child such a question? And why did the girl suddenly look like she knew the answer long before that desperate moment in the airplane cabin? Before anyone would think to ask a child about Top Gun, her story began in the dust and heat of Nevada. The desert stretched endless and golden outside the fences of the Naval Air Station where she grew up. Jets roared overhead almost daily, slicing through the sky with speed and precision. For most children living near bases, those thunderous sounds were background noise. For her, they were a heartbeat. Her father, Commander James, was a man of routine, discipline, and quiet pride. He wore his uniform like a second skin and carried the weight of decades of service. To the world, he was a decorated Navy pilot, one of those rare men who had trained at Top Gun, the Navy's most elite fighter school. To his daughter, he was simply Dad, the one who walked her to school in flight boots and taught her bedtime stories not from fairy tales but from the skis. Unlike most parents, he never believed children should be kept away from difficult truths. Knowledge, he often told her, is the difference between panic and survival. That philosophy shaped her childhood. While other girls her age were learning jump rope and gossiping about cartoons, she was learning how to identify aircraft silhouettes by memory and repeat radio codes without error. It began almost by accident. At 8 years old, she wandered into a hangar where her father and his squadron were gathered around a simulator. She was supposed to be coloring in a book while waiting for him to finish, but the glowing screens and rows of switches pulled her in like a magnet. The pilots chuckled when she asked questions, amused by her curiosity. One evening, when no one else was around, her father lifted her into the simulator seat. "Go on," he said, pointing at the stick. "Just keep your hands light." What began as a playful gesture revealed something startling. She seemed to understand instinctively what to do. Her small hands moved with confidence, her eyes tracking every gauge, every light. When the simulation ended, one of the squadron members whistled low. "Kid got the touch," he muttered. From then on, she became a quiet fixture in the hangars. After hours, when the real work was done, her father would sometimes allow her to sit in on simulator runs. At first, the squadron treated it like a novelty, a little girl pretending to fly a fighter jet. But then they realized she wasn't pretending. She was learning, fast. By 10, she could repeat complex checklists from memory. When alarms blared during mock emergencies, she knew which switches to hit, which protocols to follow. The men gave her a nickname, Shadow Cadet. It started as a joke, whispered with a grin, but soon carried respect. She moved through the hangar like a ghost, absorbing everything. She never spoke much, but her eyes missed nothing. Still, her father insisted on boundaries. She was not a pilot. She was not part of the Navy. She was a child, and no one outside the squadron could know just how much she understood. He feared what might happen if higher ranks discovered her involvement. Rules were rules, and this crossed every line. But love for his daughter and quiet pride in her abilities made him bend those rules behind closed doors. Her mother worried. She wanted her daughter to have a normal childhood, dances, school plays, sleepovers. "She's not a soldier, James," she often argued, but James would shake his head. "No, she's not," he admitted, "but she sees the sky differently. She was born with it." Those early years formed the foundation of who she would become. She lived 2 lives, the ordinary one at school, where she doodled in notebooks and pretended to fit in, and the extraordinary one behind base gates, where she listened to pilots debate tactics and memorized call signs. The line between the two grew sharper with each passing year, yet she never complained. She carried her secret proudly, even if no one else could ever know. And though she didn't realize it yet, those secret nights in the simulator, those whispered lessons from her father, were quietly preparing her for a moment that would one day come. A moment far from Nevada, high above the clouds, when her knowledge would no longer be a game. It would be survival. By the time she turned 11, the line between play and practice had vanished. What had begun as harmless evenings inside flight simulators had grown into something else entirely. Training, though never official, never sanctioned. Her father pretended it was all a game, but he knew. The squadron knew. She knew. The simulator became her second home. She memorized every panel, every glowing dial, until she could close her eyes and reconstruct the cockpit in her mind. She could point to switches in the dark, flip them in the right sequence, and know by the sound of the engine model whether the simulated jet was in trouble. She practiced emergency landings over and over until she no longer thought of them as emergencies. To her, they were just part of flying. The squadron pilots watched with a strange mix of disbelief and amusement. One, a grizzled veteran with salt and pepper hair, shook his head after seeing her maneuver out of a simulated stall. "I've seen grown men freeze up in that scenario," he muttered. "But she just does it. No hesitation." They stopped laughing when she flew. The nickname Shadow Cadet stuck, but it was no longer a joke. It was respect. Her father, though proud, grew uneasy. He wanted her to have the instincts, yes, but he also knew the danger of feeding her gift too far. Still, he couldn't deny the spark in her eyes when she flew. She absorbed knowledge like oxygen. To deny her was like asking her not to breathe. Her training expanded beyond simulators. She followed her father through hangars, asking endless questions about the mechanics of engines, the physics of lift, the importance of timing in maneuvers. He indulged her curiosity, explaining terms in words she could grasp. Before long, she didn't just understand, she challenged him. "What if you banked a second earlier?" she asked once, tracing diagrams on a scrap of paper. "You'd be in position faster." Her father raised an eyebrow. "You've been studying tactics now." She only smiled. At 12, she began sitting in on briefings. She wasn't supposed to be there, but the squadron let her slip into the back, unnoticed, sketching in a notebook as pilots debated scenarios. She memorized every word. Later, she'd recreate entire discussions on paper, diagrams of dogfights she'd never seen, analyzing where pilots made mistakes. The men shook their heads in disbelief. One of them whispered once, "She's going to outfly all of us someday." Of course, it was never official. On paper, she was nothing more than a child living on base. The Navy had no record of her sitting in simulators, studying tactics, or correcting adults. If anyone higher up had discovered the truth, her father could have faced serious consequences. But the squadron closed ranks around her. They never wrote her name down, never mentioned her in reports. She was their ghost, the unseen cadet who shouldn't exist. And she loved it. She loved the hum of engines, the smell of jet fuel, the way the ground shook as fighters tore into the sky. She lived for those stolen moments in the simulator when she wasn't just a kid. She was a pilot, sharp and unflinching. But with her gift came an odd weight. She didn't brag. She didn't boast. Outside the base, she said nothing of her double life. Her classmates at school saw only a shy girl who doodled airplanes in the margins of her notebooks. They had no idea she could explain every switch in a cockpit, no idea she could land a simulated jet with an engine out. Her father often wrestled with the balance. "You're too young," he would tell her, but she would smile and repeat back his own words. "Knowledge is the difference between panic and survival." He couldn't argue. The squadron pilots teased him about it. "James," one said, "your kid's going to graduate Top Gun before she finishes middle school." James didn't laugh. He knew they were only half joking. What none of them realized, not yet, was that these years of secret, unofficial training were not simply a child's fascination. They were shaping her instincts for a future no one could predict. A future where every checklist, every maneuver, every lesson whispered in hangars at midnight would matter more than anyone imagined. For now, she remained the Shadow Cadet, a legend in the making that lived only in whispers. But legends, as history shows, have a way of stepping out of shadows when the world needs them most. By the time she turned 12, the Shadow Cadet had become part of the rhythm of base life. Pilots were used to seeing her perched in the corner of briefing rooms, scribbling notes. They were used to her questions, sometimes sharper than the ones rookies asked. They were even used to her quiet confidence in the simulator. But everyone still believed there was a line, an invisible barrier between simulation and reality. That line shattered on a crisp spring morning. The day began like any other drill. Her father and his squadron were scheduled for practice runs over the desert. The girl had begged to come along, as usual, and though her mother disapproved, James finally relented. She stood near the control tower with a headset too big for her ears, eyes fixed on the runway where her father's FA-18 Hornet thundered into the sky. The jet cut through the morning air with effortless grace, banking into formation with two others. Inside the tower, the atmosphere was casual. Technicians monitored screens, officers called out numbers, and the squadron's chatter filled the headsets. Nothing unusual, until the alarm sounded. A sharp, piercing tone sliced through the room. One of the aircraft, her father's, was losing power. Red lights flashed across the consoles. The technician on comms shouted into the radio, giving standard emergency instructions. Panic rippled through the tower. Her heart stopped. On the monitors, she watched the jet stutter, wobble, its movements erratic. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. The voices in the tower overlapped, issuing rapid commands, but to her young ears they were missing something. They were telling him the wrong fix. She saw it, the pattern on the screen, the telltale signs of a specific failure she had studied countless times in the simulator. Her pulse hammered. If her father followed their orders, he would stall completely. He wouldn't recover. He wouldn't come back. She ripped the oversized headset from her ears and dashed forward, her small voice cutting through the chaos. "It's not the hydraulics," she screamed, tugging at the radio officer's sleeve. "It's the fuel line. He needs to switch over now, switch tanks and reset the flow." The room froze. For a split second, the officer just stared at her. Then another pilot, one who had spent hours watching her in simulators, leaned in. "She's right," he barked. "Get it through." The radio crackled as the correction was relayed to her father mid-flight. A heartbeat later, the Hornet steadied. The monitor showed the jet leveling, its descent slowing, its movements regaining control. Gasps and relieved curses filled the tower. Her father's calm voice came over comms. "Fuel flow reset." She caught it, bringing her down. No one moved as the jet circled back, descending carefully toward the runway. Every second felt stretched. The landing gear lowered, the wheels kissed the asphalt, and with a squeal of tires, the jet slowed safely to a stop. Only then did the control tower erupt in shouts of relief. Men clapped each other's backs. A few stared openly at the girl, as though seeing her for the first time. She stood frozen, chest heaving, eyes locked on the runway. Her father climbed down from the jet minutes later, removing his helmet, his face pale but steady. When he spotted her through the glass of the tower, he raised a hand, not just in greeting but in acknowledgement. He knew exactly who had saved him. The Navy tried to bury the story almost immediately. Reports were scrubbed, details left vague. Officially, it was logged as a technical error corrected in time. Nowhere did it mention a 12-year-old girl catching what trained officers had missed. But inside the squadron, nothing was the same. Pilots whispered about her in the mess hall, their voices carrying both awe and unease. She had crossed the line, no longer just a shadow cadet. She had stepped into the realm of real pilots, and she had proved herself. For her, the moment changed everything. She understood now that her knowledge wasn't a game. She had seen the difference between panic and survival, just as her father had taught her. And this time, survival had depended on her. The legend of the Shadow Cadet had just been written in fire across the Nevada desert skis. After the incident in Nevada, everything changed, and not in the way she expected. For weeks, the squadron whispered about her. They called her the girl who saved a pilot. Some said it was luck, others insisted it was instinct, but everyone agreed on one thing. She had done what no 12-year-old should have been able to do. Word spread quietly in hushed tones because officially the event had never happened. No paperwork mentioned her. No officer dared put her name in a report. But inside the base, she was no longer invisible. Her father, however, understood the danger. The higher-ups would not see her as a prodigy. They would see her as a problem, a child who had slipped into a world she was never meant to touch. If her name ever reached the wrong ears, the Navy might question his judgment, his career, and possibly worse. So almost overnight, he decided to step away. Retirement papers were filed sooner than anyone expected. "It's time," he told his wife. "We need distance." She didn't argue. She had long worried about her daughter's double life, one foot in childhood, the other in a fighter jet's cockpit. To her, leaving was a relief, but to the girl it felt like exile. They packed up their lives and moved to a quiet suburb far from the roar of engines. The desert skis gave way to cul-de-sacs and shopping centers. The girl enrolled in a regular middle school, where lockers lined hallways and the loudest sound was the bell between classes. On the surface, it looked like a fresh start, but inside she was restless. The classroom lessons felt unbearably slow compared to the high-speed calculations she once practiced in simulators. While her classmates struggled through fractions, she was mentally running through flight checklists, remembering the exact sequence of switches to restart a failed engine. To them, she was just another quiet girl who doodled in her notebook. They never realized her sketches weren't random drawings but detailed diagrams of aircraft panels. They laughed at her silence, mistaking it for shyness, never knowing her mind was trained to think in emergencies most adults couldn't handle. Her teachers noticed little except that she often seemed distracted. "Daydreaming again," one scolded gently when she failed to answer a question. But her daydreams weren't about boys or birthday parties. They were about altitude, thrust, and the feel of controls in her hands. Her mother encouraged her to join normal activities, art club, school dances, weekend outings with friends. The girl went along, but she always felt like an outsider. Conversations about music or fashion slipped past her. How could she explain that what she missed wasn't a TV show or a trend, but the hum of jet engines in the distance? Her father noticed the change, though he rarely spoke of it. Some evenings he caught her staring at the sky as if waiting for a formation to appear. He would sit beside her, silent, the two of them bound by a secret neither could share with the world. Once she finally asked the question that had been gnawing at her. "Dad, am I supposed to just forget all of it?" He sighed, the kind of sigh that carried both pride and regret. "No," he said quietly. "You don't forget something like that, you carry it. You just carry it differently now." So she learned to wear a mask. At school, she was quiet, ordinary, almost invisible. At home, she buried her notebooks of sketches under her bed, hidden from curious eyes. Her old shadow cadet faded into silence. But though she tried to blend in, the instincts never left her. Every sound of an aircraft overhead made her heart race. Every news story about pilots or training drills pulled her back to who she had been. And deep down, she knew something her parents didn't want to admit. You can take a girl out of the skis, but you cannot take the skis out of the girl. She was only waiting, though she didn't yet know for what. The hum of the engines was steady again, but the girl could sense something beneath it, a vibration, subtle at first, then growing. Most passengers dismissed the first few bumps as ordinary turbulence, but she felt it differently. Her instincts, honed years earlier in simulators and hangars, recognized the rhythm. This wasn't random rough air. It was mechanical. The plane jolted harder. Drinks toppled, a laptop slid from a tray table, and nervous laughter rippled through the cabin. The girl's mother reached for her hand. "It's fine," she whispered, though her grip betrayed unease. Then came the announcement. The captain's voice, calm but with an edge, filled the cabin. "Ladies, and please remain seated with your belts fastened. We're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Nothing to worry about." But the girl knew better. She closed her eyes, listening to the engines as if they were voices. Something in their tone was wrong. She leaned forward slightly, every nerve in her body remembering the drills she was never supposed to know. Minutes later, the captain appeared in the aisle. That alone rattled the crew. Pilots rarely left the cockpit in mid-crisis. His eyes swept the rows until they landed on her. His pace slowed. Recognition flickered. She sat by the emergency exit, hoodie sleeves covering her hands, sketchbook closed on her lap. Her mother looked up, startled as the captain crouched at their row. His voice dropped low. "You've flown before, haven't you? Top Gun." Her heart slammed against her ribs. Around them, passengers turned, confused. Some chuckled nervously, others stared in disbelief. Her mother bristled, pulling her daughter close. "She's 14, she said sharply. "What are you talking about?" But the captain ignored her, his eyes locked on the girl. "Your father," he pressed softly, "James, I knew him. Flew with him once years ago." The girl's throat tightened. Her father's name here, at 30,000 feet, spoken by a man in uniform, felt like the past breaking through the walls she'd built. She didn't answer, but her silence was answer enough. The captain glanced at the trembling cabin, then back at her. "We've got a systems issue. I need a second opinion. And I think you know what you're hearing, don't you?" Passengers nearby gawked openly now, whispering furiously. "Is he serious? He's asking a kid," someone muttered. "What's going on?" Her mother shook her head in disbelief. "This is insane. She's just a child." But the girl sat very still, staring at the floor. The sound of the engines pulsed through her bones. She thought back to every midnight in the simulator, every checklist she had memorized, every emergency she had practiced until it felt natural. She could hear what others couldn't. Something was off in the fuel system, maybe pressure imbalance. She knew it. When she finally lifted her eyes, the look in them startled even her mother. Gone was the shy, quiet child of middle school. In her gaze was the sharpness of someone who had spent years living in the shadows of cockpits. "What do you need to know?" she asked quietly. The captain's shoulders dropped, as if he had been holding his breath waiting for her response. He nodded once, a silent pact between them. Around them, passengers exchanged bewildered glances. A man in a business suit whispered, "This can't be real." A flight attendant looked ready to protest but froze when she saw the captain's face. He wasn't joking. The girl's mother clutched her hand. "You don't have to do this," she whispered desperately. But the girl did not answer, because deep down she knew she already had no choice. The turbulence struck again, harder this time. A tray crashed in the galley, a baby wailed, and oxygen masks rattled loose above their heads. Panic rippled through the cabin, and in the middle of it all, a 14-year-old girl sat in silence, her mind already shifting into patterns and protocols no one else on that plane could understand. The shadow cadet was back. The cabin was chaos. Passengers shouted over one another, some fumbling with masks, others gripping armrests so tightly their knuckles turned white. The flight attendants scrambled, trying to keep order, but fear spread faster than their reassurances. And in the middle of it, the girl's face was calm. Not calm like a child too frightened to react, but calm in a way that startled even the captain. Her breathing steadied, her shoulders squared. She looked like someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. The captain leaned closer. "We've got a fuel pressure drop on the right engine. It's intermittent, unstable. I don't know how long she'll hold." His words were barely audible over the rumble of the plane. Her mother tugged at her arm. "This isn't your problem. Let him handle it." But the girl shook her head slowly, her eyes fixed on the captain. "How bad?" she asked. Her voice was steady, sharper than before. The captain blinked. He was staring at a teenager in a hoodie, but for a fleeting second it felt like briefing a co-pilot. "If we lose it completely, we won't make Denver. Closest strip is 200 miles out. We'll need to feather controls to balance." She nodded, her mind racing through every emergency procedure she had ever studied. Not the ones in textbooks, the classified ones. The training drills she had memorized years ago by watching, by listening, by sneaking into places she was never meant to be. She closed her eyes briefly, picturing the panel in front of her, the dials, the switches, the sequence. The answer surfaced like muscle memory. Check the. If the right tank's pressure isn't stabilizing, the transfer might be lagging. You'll have to reset it manually. The captain's jaw tightened. "That's exactly what I was thinking." His eyes searched hers, looking for doubt but found none. Passengers stared in disbelief. A businessman scoffed audibly. "You're listening to her. She's a kid." But the plane jolted again, a sickening drop that silenced the argument. Drinks flew, a woman screamed, and even the attendant stumbled. Everyone's eyes went back to the captain and then to the girl. She didn't flinch. Instead, she reached for the armrest, gripping it like a yoke, steadying her posture. If the pressure's oscillating, don't fight it. Let it level. Then ease the throttle. Slow adjustments, not sharp ones, or you'll flame it out completely. The captain hesitated, torn between disbelief and the undeniable precision of her instructions. Finally, he gave a single curt nod. "Come with me." Her mother gasped, pulling her close. "No, absolutely not." The captain crouched, meeting the mother's eyes. "Ma'am, I've flown combat sorties and I've been in more cockpits than I can count. Your daughter knows things no kid should know. And right now, she might be the only one who can help us get this bird on the ground." The words hung in the air. The mother's eyes filled with tears, caught between fear for her daughter and the reality pressing down on every soul in the cabin. Finally, with trembling hands, she released her grip. "Be careful," she whispered. The girl stood, her legs steady even as the plane lurched beneath her. She followed the captain down the aisle, every pair of eyes tracking her as though she were walking into fire. Passengers whispered, prayed, some scoffed, but all of them watched. When the cockpit door closed behind her, the noise of the cabin muffled. The space was filled with blinking lights and urgent alarms. The co-pilot looked up, wide-eyed at the sight of a teenager stepping inside. "What the?" "She's with me," the captain cut in. "Listen." The girl slid into the jump seat, eyes sweeping across the panels. And just like that, she wasn't 14 anymore. She was the cadet she had once been, in secret, focused, calculating, alive. She pointed at the flickering gauge. "There, it's starving the line. Reset the feed, then stagger the draw. It'll balance the burn." The co-pilot glanced at the captain, doubt flashing in his eyes. But the captain didn't hesitate. He trusted her. And when he followed her instructions, the rumble in the engines shifted, stabilized, the alarm slowed, the plane steadied. A hush filled the cockpit. The girl let out a single breath, calm as ever. "Now," she said, her eyes flicking to the captain, "let's land this thing." Cockpit was silent except for the drone of the engines and the urgent blink of warning lights. Every second felt stretched thin, suspended between survival and disaster. The captain's hands hovered over the controls, but his eyes kept flicking toward the girl in the jump seat. She sat than most seasoned co-pilots, her gaze locked on the gauges. "We've stabilized fuel flow," the co-pilot said, though his voice trembled. "But Denver's still out of reach. Closest runway is a regional strip in Nebraska, barely long enough for this aircraft." The captain cursed under his breath. "It'll have to do." The girl spoke softly but with a clarity that cut through the fear. "Then you can't come in heavy. You'll have to dump before descent." The captain blinked. "You've studied fuel dumping procedures." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her eyes were already calculating distance, weight, altitude. It was instinct. She had been trained, unofficially but relentlessly, in a world that had never belonged to her. Now, at 30,000 feet, that stolen training was saving lives. The captain toggled the controls, initiating the dump sequence. The aircraft shuddered slightly as excess fuel sprayed into the cold night air. Minutes passed like hours. Every adjustment felt like walking a tightrope in the dark. Then, through the windshield, the faint glow of runway lights appeared. A thin strip of salvation carved into endless darkness. "We've got one shot," the captain said. His voice was calm, but sweat lined his forehead. "No go-around, no second try." The girl leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Keep her nose high. Don't chase the descent, let it glide. If you fight it, you'll stall." Her words weren't spoken like suggestions. They were orders, crisp and confident, the way her father used to speak in briefing rooms. For a moment, even the co-pilot forgot she was 14. The aircraft dipped lower, the cabin rattling. Behind the sealed door, passengers held hands, whispered prayers, clutched armrests as though they could anchor themselves to survival. The runway loomed closer. "Steady," she whispered. Her voice was calm, impossibly calm. "Feather it, now ease, hold her." The captain's hands followed the rhythm of her words as though she were a second set of instruments guiding him down. The landing gear screeched, wheels biting asphalt, the fuselage groaning under the strain. The cabin shook violently, then steadied. The roar dulled into a rolling thunder as the jet slowed, brakes screaming, until finally, mercifully, the plane shuddered to a stop at the end of the strip. For a moment no one breathed. Then, as if a spell broke, the cabin erupted. Applause, sobs, cheers, strangers clung to one another, their terror dissolving into relief. In the cockpit, the co-pilot sagged against his seat, whispering, "We made it." The captain looked at the girl, still composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "No," he said quietly, "she made it." The cockpit door opened, and the girl followed the captain back into the cabin. Every eye turned toward her, the teenager in the hoodie, the one no one had noticed before. But now they looked at her as though she were something unreal, something out of legend. Her mother rushed forward, arms wrapping around her, trembling with equal parts fear and pride. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered. "You never will," the girl answered softly. The captain addressed the passengers, his voice steady but tinged with awe. "Tonight, this flight was saved by someone extraordinary. She won't say it, but I will. We owe our lives to her." Applause thundered through the cabin again, louder than before. But the girl's eyes dropped to the floor. She didn't want glory. She wanted silence, anonymity. She wanted her secret life to remain hers. And yet she knew something had shifted. Her past, the one her father tried to bury, was no longer just memory. It was alive again, demanding to be carried forward. As the passengers disembarked, many paused to thank her, some with tears in their eyes. She nodded politely but said little. To them, she was a miracle. To herself, she was simply the shadow cadet, caught between the world of children and the world of pilots. Later, as the night stretched quiet around the tarmac, the captain found her one last time. "You belong up there," he said, pointing toward the stars. "Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise." She didn't answer right away. She just looked at the sky, the same sky she once thought she'd lost forever. And in her silence was a promise that this was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning.